The rain had just stopped when I stepped out of the cab, my shoes sinking slightly into the soft mud of my sister's driveway. The air was heavy with the scent of wet grass and perfume from the lilac bushes she'd planted along the path, always perfectly trimmed, perfectly arranged, like everything else in her life. I looked down at myself at the faded navy cardigan I'd owned for over a decade, the hemline fraying where I'd carelessly caught it on a nail years ago. My jeans were worn thin at the knees, and the soles of my shoes had started to separate just a little at the edges. I could already picture the look on my sister's face. She'd glance at me once from head to toe, that familiar flicker of pity, or was it disgust, before pasting on her smile. I hadn't visited in over 3 years. It wasn't because I didn't want to, but because every time I did, I left feeling smaller. Smaller than the shiny marble floor she walked on. Smaller than her sparkling kitchen where everything matched. Smaller than the life she'd built while I'd been busy just trying to survive. But this time was different. This time, I came with something they didn't expect. Something they'd never imagine a woman like me could have. When I pushed open the heavy front door, laughter spilled out before I even saw their faces. My sister Melinda stood by the island, her blonde hair styled in those effortless waves that probably took an hour to achieve. Her husband Thomas was pouring champagne into tall glasses. Their son Mason, now in college, was home for the weekend, charming as ever. Even my mother was there, sitting in her favorite chair, wrapped in pearls that had once belonged to my grandmother. "Look who finally decided to show up," Melinda said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "We thought maybe you'd forgotten where we live." I smiled faintly. I didn't forget. "Just been busy." She arched an eyebrow. "Busy? Doing what exactly?" It was meant to sound casual, but we both knew it wasn't. To her, busy was what successful people said when they were managing companies, raising perfect families, or flying off to vacation homes. Not when they were working odd jobs, living quietly and staying out of sight. "Working?" I said softly, setting my old canvas bag down near the door. Thomas smirked. "Still at that little thrift store?" "Yes," I answered. "Still there." Melinda's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, at least you're consistent." My mother didn't say much. She never did when we were together. She'd just watch her eyes darting between us like a referee at a match she couldn't stop. Dinner was served soon after. The table looked like a magazine spread porcelain plates, crystal glasses, candles flickering between vases of roses. I sat across from Melinda, who'd changed into a silky champagne-colored blouse, and next to Mason, who barely looked up from his phone. "So what brings you here?" Melinda asked as she carved into her steak. "You never come for no reason." "I just wanted to see everyone I said." "Really?" she replied. "Because last time you came, you wanted to borrow money." The words landed heavier than the clinking of silverware. I forced a small laugh. "You're right. I did. And I paid you back." She tilted her head. "After 6 months, better late than never." Thomas chuckled. "That's what losers say." I stared at my plate. My mother sighed quietly, as if she wished I'd just learned to let it go. That I'd stop showing up, stop giving them the satisfaction of making me feel less, but she didn't know that I wasn't the same woman they used to pity. I wasn't here to ask for help this time. I was here for something else. As they continued to talk about their vacations, their stocks, their plans for the lake house renovation, I felt like an outsider at my own family's table. They spoke in numbers I couldn't relate to. Their lives revolved around acquisitions, investments, upgrades. Mine revolved around people. The customers who came into the store with stories hidden behind their eyes. The quiet satisfaction of helping someone find something they thought they'd never afford. The thrill of turning discarded things into treasures. But to them, my world was small. And tonight, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. When the plates were cleared, Melinda leaned back in her chair and looked at me again. "You really should treat yourself sometime, you know. Get new clothes, maybe a proper handbag." "I like my clothes." I said, looking down at the cardigan. She laughed softly. That's cute, but presentation matters. You never know who's watching. I know, I replied quietly. I've been watched my whole life. She blinked, unsure what I meant. I didn't elaborate. After dessert, I reached for my bag. The room fell silent when I pulled out a small envelope and placed it on the table. What's that? Thomas asked, half smiling. Something I wanted to share with all of you, I said. Since you always worry about me, I thought maybe this would ease your minds. Melinda frowned and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it, and as her eyes moved down the page, her smirk faltered. Her expression changed confusion first, then disbelief. What is this? She whispered. It's my bank statement, I said. Thomas leaned closer, snatched it from her hands, and scanned it quickly. His eyes widened. This can't be right. It is, I said calmly. You can call the bank if you'd like. My mother squinted, trying to see the numbers. How much? Melinda swallowed hard before saying, over 8 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mason looked up from his phone. I didn't move. I just let them sit with it. You must be joking, Melinda finally said. There's no way. There is. I interrupted softly. And it's been that way for a while, Thomas scoffed. What, did you win the lottery? No. Then what? I looked around the table, the same people who had once turned their backs on me when I couldn't afford to pay for Mom's surgery. The same sister who told me I embarrassed her at social events. The same brother-in-law who joked about me being the family charity case. I built something, I said, slowly, quietly, out of the same things you all thought were worthless. Melinda's mouth tightened. You mean that thrift store? Yes, I said. That thrift store. They didn't understand. They never had. What began as a small, second-hand shop run out of a rented garage had become something much larger. I'd learned how to find hidden gems in estate sales, how to spot value where others saw junk. I started reselling online. I reinvested every penny. The business grew. Then I began collecting antique furniture, refurbishing it, creating partnerships with interior designers who loved my pieces. I'd built a chain of stores across 3 states under a brand that had become quietly popular with people who appreciated authenticity over flash. But I'd never bragged. I'd never said a word, because what I wanted more than money was peace. Melinda stared at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. You're lying. You wouldn't even know how to manage that kind of money. I didn't need to know at first, I said. I learned. Thomas let out a low whistle. All this time, you've been sitting on millions, and you let us think you were broke. I wasn't sitting on it, I replied. I was living my life. My mother looked at me, tears forming in her eyes. Why didn't you tell us? Because you wouldn't have listened, I said softly. You only see what's shiny. You never look deeper. Melinda pushed back from the table, her cheeks flushed. You're unbelievable. You come here looking like that just to rub it in our faces. No, I said. I came here to remind you that worth doesn't always look like wealth. For the first time, no one had anything to say. The rain started again outside, soft at first, then steady. It was strange how peaceful it sounded now, tapping against the windows, drowning out the heavy silence in the room. When I stood to leave, my mother caught my hand. You're still my little girl, she said quietly. No matter what you wear. Her voice trembled, but there was something in her eyes, something that looked like pride or maybe regret. I squeezed her hand gently. That's all I ever wanted to hear. As I walked back to the door, I felt Melinda's stare burning into my back. She couldn't stand not being the one with the upper hand. I knew her well enough to know she wouldn't let this go quietly, but I didn't care. I'd spent too many years measuring myself against her shadow. That night, I finally stepped out of it. Outside, the rain was heavier, the air cooler. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and smiled as I walked toward the cab. My clothes were still the same, but something in me had changed. They had always seen me as the poor one, the failure, the embarrassment. But tonight, they saw something they couldn't understand, a woman who'd found success without needing their validation. And that, I realized, was the sweetest kind of revenge. The following morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls. My phone buzzed endlessly, the screen lighting up with names I hadn't heard from in months. Melinda Thomas, even Mason. I let it ring, over and over, until finally I answered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Melinda's voice shot through the line like an arrow. "You humiliated me in front of everyone, including Mom." I sat up slowly, the early sunlight filtering through my thin curtains. My apartment wasn't grand, but it was warm and filled with quiet meaning. Every object here had a story. A restored oak table I'd rescued from a junkyard. A lamp made from a broken violin. Pieces of the world that others had discarded now whole again. "Humiliated you?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. "I didn't say a single unkind word last night." "You didn't have to," she snapped. "You let me look like a fool." "Melinda," I said softly, "you didn't need my help to do that." There was silence on the other end for a long time before she spoke again. "You think you're better than us now, don't you?" I sighed. "No. I just think I finally stopped believing I was less." She hung up without another word. That was the moment I realized something deeper. That this wasn't just about money. It was about how my family had built their sense of worth by comparison. As long as I stayed small, they could feel big. My pain had been their reassurance that they were doing life right. But when I outgrew their narrative, they panicked. Later that afternoon, I visited my store downtown, a large converted warehouse with soft amber lights and rows of carefully arranged displays. Customers moved through the aisles, their hands brushing over vintage dresses, old records, hand-painted ceramics. I greeted them by name, the way I always did. "Morning, Miss Parker," a young woman called out as she placed a small chest on the counter. "You're the owner, right? I've been coming here for years. This place feels like home." I smiled. That's exactly what I wanted it to be. When I first opened this shop, people laughed at me. "Who'd want to buy other people's junk?" Melinda had asked, then rolling her eyes. But I knew the truth, that every object had memory. That sometimes what others call junk just needs someone to see its value again. Maybe people weren't so different. As I ran my hand over the polished surface of an antique dresser, I thought about my mother. About how she'd raised us alone after Dad died, working double shifts at the diner just to keep the lights on. Melinda always hated those years. She'd talk about how embarrassed she was that Mom wore the same shoes to church every Sunday. I, on the other hand, saw strength in her sacrifices. When Mom grew older, she started depending on Melinda, more mainly because Melinda could afford it. She moved into her house surrounded by things that sparkled, though she never looked comfortable there. Sometimes I'd call and hear the hollowness in her voice, but she'd always say she was fine. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "Melinda's been upset." "I figured," I replied. "She's not used to being surprised." Mom hesitated. "You could have told me, about your success." "I wanted to," I said, "but I didn't want it to change things between us." "Things always change, darling," she murmured. "But sometimes change is what shows us the truth." There was a pause, long enough that I could hear the faint sound of her breathing. "She told me you embarrassed her, but I told her maybe she needed to be embarrassed. Maybe she's forgotten what humility feels like." I smiled to myself. "That's unlike you, Mom. I'm old," she said with a small laugh. "Old people earn the right to speak the truth once in a while." I wanted to visit her, to just sit with her like we used to, but I knew Melinda wouldn't allow it easily. My sister guarded her pride like a fortress, every act of kindness filtered through the lens of control. Still, a few days later, I got in my car and drove to the house again. The sky was overcast, clouds moving fast, wind lifting the leaves off the trees. When I knocked, Melinda opened the door. Her hair was pulled back this time, her face bare, and for the first time in years, she looked human. "What do you want?" she asked. "I came to see Mom." "She's resting," she replied curtly. "You can't just show up here whenever you feel like it." "I think I can," I said quietly, stepping past her before she could stop me. Mom was sitting in her armchair by the window, knitting something soft and pale blue. When she saw me, her face lit up. "Sweetheart," she said warmly. "You came." I knelt beside her and took her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, the skin papery thin, but her grip was strong. "I missed you," I whispered. "I missed you too." Melinda stood at the doorway, arms folded, her jaw tight. "I'll give you 2 a minute," she muttered, though the bitterness in her tone made it clear she didn't mean it kindly. As the door clicked shut behind her, Mom sighed. "She's been impossible since that night." "I can imagine. She keeps saying you did it to hurt her." "I didn't," I said, looking down. "I just stopped pretending." Mom smiled faintly. "That's what scares her most. You were always the quiet one, the one she thought would never fight back." We sat there for a long time, listening to the wind outside. It was strange how peaceful the silence felt, even with all the unspoken things between us. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You know your father left something for you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "A letter," she said softly. "He wrote it before he passed. I was supposed to give it to you when the time was right." She reached into the small drawer beside her and pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I took it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, written in his familiar slanted handwriting. "My dear Nora, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the woman I always knew you'd be, stronger than the world expected and kinder than it deserved. I know life won't be easy for you. You'll be underestimated, overlooked, maybe even mocked. But don't let that dim you, because what people call weakness is often just quiet power, waiting for its moment. When others chase gold, chase purpose. When they measure worth by what shines, remember that light doesn't come from things, it comes from within. You were never meant to fit into their world, Nora. You were meant to build your own." I couldn't breathe for a moment. Tears blurred the ink, the words smudging under my fingertips. "He believed in you," Mom whispered, "even when you didn't." I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the years I'd spent trying to prove my worth to people who'd never see it. I realized how much I'd lost, not in money, but in time. Time I'd wasted seeking approval from a family that only loved versions of me that made them feel superior. A week later, I invited Mom to move in with me. It took some convincing, but eventually she agreed. Melinda didn't take it well. She showed up at my store the following week, her heels clicking across the polished floor like gunshots. Customers turned to look as she approached. "Can we talk?" she hissed. I gestured toward the back office. Once the door closed, she rounded on me. "So now you're stealing Mom too." "I'm not stealing anyone," I said. "She deserves peace." "You're doing this to make me look bad." I met her gaze evenly. "You're doing that all by yourself." For a moment, her expression faltered, and I saw something fragile break behind her eyes. Fear, maybe, or shame. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Don't think this changes anything," she said coldly. "Money doesn't make you family." I smiled sadly. "Neither does cruelty." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that the framed photo on the wall rattled. When I looked at that photo, a picture of me standing in front of my first tiny store paint, still drying on the sign, I felt something close to relief. I wasn't angry anymore. Just free. And as Mom later sat by my kitchen window, sipping tea and humming an old tune from her diner days, I knew I'd made the right choice. For the first time in decades, the house felt like home. Not because it was fancy or large, but because it was filled with peace, laughter, and the kind of love that doesn't need to prove itself. It was early autumn when everything finally began to settle. The air had turned crisp, the mornings quieter, and my days took on a rhythm I hadn't known I was craving. Mom had moved in fully by then. She kept a small room overlooking the garden where the sunlight poured in just right in the mornings. Every day she'd sit by the window, crocheting or reading one of her old mystery novels. Sometimes she'd hum, and I'd pause in the doorway listening. Her presence filled the house in ways money never could. But peace, I learned, doesn't always stay unchallenged. One afternoon, as I was reviewing paperwork for a new store opening in Chicago, my assistant knocked gently. "Miss Parker, there's a woman outside asking for you. Says it's family." I didn't need to ask who. Melinda stood in the doorway, her posture perfect as always, but there was something different about her. Her lipstick slightly smudged her hands, trembling as she clutched her designer bag. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I nodded and motioned to the chair across from me. She sat down slowly, eyes darting around the office, taking in the awards on the wall, the framed newspaper article that called my brand the Hidden Heirlooms of America. "So," she said finally, "you've done well for yourself." "I have," I said simply. "I didn't come here to fight," she added quickly. "I need your help." That wasn't something I ever expected to hear from her. "What's going on?" She hesitated. "Thomas left." I blinked. "Left as in gone," she said, voice cracking. "Took money from our joint account. He's in Florida with some 26-year-old he met online." I sat back, letting that sink in. For years, Thomas had played the role of the perfect husband, the successful businessman, the charming host, the man who prided himself on being above everyone else, including me. Melinda's eyes welled up. He cleaned out everything. The house, the savings, even Mason's college fund. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, though a part of me couldn't help feeling the sting of irony. She let out a bitter laugh. "Don't say sorry. You warned me once. I remember. You said, you can't build a life on pretending. I thought you were being dramatic." I didn't reply. She wasn't wrong. Years ago, I had said those words during one of our worst fights. She'd laughed at me, then told me I was just jealous. Now here she was, sitting in my office, her perfect life shattered. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't even know where to start." There was a time when hearing that would have filled me with satisfaction. But instead, I felt a strange ache in my chest. Despite everything, she was still my sister. "Start by breathing," I said gently. "Then by forgiving yourself." She looked up sharply. "Forgive myself for what?" "For believing that being loved means being admired. It doesn't. It means being seen. And he never saw you, Melinda?" "Not really." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. "I've been so awful to you." "Yes," I said quietly. "You have." She flinched, but I didn't say it to wound her. Just to be honest. "I wanted to hurt you sometimes," she confessed, voice trembling. "Because every time I looked at you, I saw what I couldn't be content. I thought if I made you feel small, I'd feel bigger." The room was still. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then she asked the question I never thought I'd hear. "Can you help me?" I didn't answer right away. I just studied her face, the fine lines around her mouth, the vulnerability she used to hide behind arrogance. "Yes," I said finally, "but not with money." She frowned. "Then with what?" "Perspective." She blinked, confused. "You spent your whole life chasing approval, Melinda. From Dad, from men, from society, and you made everyone else feel small to protect yourself from feeling that way. You don't need a check from me. You need to find something that's yours. Something real." She sat in silence, eyes glistening, as if my words were something she hadn't realized she needed to hear. That night, she stayed for dinner. Mom cooked her favorite chicken pot pie. It was the first time we'd all sat together since that dinner months ago. The air felt fragile, but sincere. At one point, Mom laughed a sound that filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Melinda smiled, and I saw the sister I used to know, the girl who once stayed up late with me under the covers, whispering about dreams and boys and all the things we wanted from life. After dinner, as we washed dishes side by side, Melinda spoke again. "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "Not being like us." I looked at her reflection in the kitchen window, both of us framed by the soft glow of light. Every single day, I said honestly. But then, I remember if I had been like you, I wouldn't have become me. She let out a small, shaky laugh. "You always know how to say things that hurt and heal at the same time." I smiled faintly. Maybe that's what truth does. Over the next few weeks, Melinda came around more often. She began helping me at the store, learning how to refinish furniture, how to listen to people's stories without judgment. At first, she was clumsy and impatient. But then I saw something soften in her, the way she smiled at customers, the way she stayed late to rearrange displays just so the store would feel warmer. One afternoon, as I was pricing new inventory, I overheard her talking to a woman at the counter. The woman looked nervous, holding a small vase she wanted to sell. "It's not worth much," she said. Melinda smiled kindly. "Everything has worth. Sometimes we just need to look at it differently." I froze. Those were my words, the same ones I'd said years ago when no one listened. Hearing them come from her lips felt like healing itself. Then came the day Mason showed up. He'd been distant since everything happened with his father. Angry, confused. Melinda had told me he blamed her for the split. But when he walked into the shop, he looked lost more than anything. "Hi, Aunt Nora," he said awkwardly. I smiled. "Hi, Mason." He glanced around. "This place is cool. Thank you." "Mom said you built it yourself." "That true?" "It is." He nodded slowly. "Guess I didn't really know what you did before. I thought you just sold old stuff." "Sometimes the old stuff tells the best stories," I said. "Want to help me move some boxes?" He shrugged. "Sure." By the end of the day, he'd learned how to sand a table and polish brass. He even smiled a few times. When Melinda came to pick him up, she watched him working, her eyes soft, in a way I hadn't seen in years. "I think he likes it here," she said quietly. "Then let him stay," I replied. He could use a place where things are rebuilt instead of thrown away. It became a pattern, Mason coming by after school, Melinda helping with displays, Mom knitting near the front counter. Somehow this store that had once been mine alone had turned into something bigger, a sanctuary for all of us. One evening after closing, Melinda handed me a small box. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it." Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, simple and elegant. "It was Grandma's," she said softly. "I want you to have it." I stared at it, stunned. She'd never given away anything sentimental before. "Why now?" I asked. Because for the first time, I understand what she used to say. "Pretty things mean nothing if your heart's ugly." I've been wearing that ugliness too long. Tears filled my eyes. "Melinda," she shook her head gently. "No more apologies. Let's just be sisters again." And in that moment, we were. Not rivals. Not opposites. Just two women who'd finally learned that love isn't about competition, it's about compassion. That night, as I sat alone after everyone had gone, I looked around my store and thought about everything it had taken to get here. The humiliation, the rejection, the endless comparisons. And I realized something powerful all along. I hadn't been trying to prove them wrong. I'd just been trying to prove myself right. Winter came early that year. Frost kissed the windows every morning, and the soft hum of the heater filled the silence in our home. By then, life had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred. Mom would wake before dawn, humming her gospel songs while the coffee brewed. Melinda would arrive mid-morning, bundled in scarves, cheeks pink from the cold, and Mason would join us after class, tracking in snow from the front step. For the first time in years, my family wasn't divided by envy, resentment, or pride. We were simply together. One evening, as we sat around the fireplace, Mom looked up from her knitting and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How pain can be the thing that finally brings people back together." Melinda smiled faintly. "Maybe it's because pain is honest?" I looked into the flames, thinking of all the years I'd spent trying to be seen by them. It wasn't until I stopped begging for recognition that they'd finally learned to look. When Mom fell ill that winter, we took turns caring for her. Her heart had grown weak, the doctor said, but she was peaceful, as though she'd already made her peace with the world. One afternoon, I came home from the store and found Melinda sitting beside her bed reading aloud from an old journal. Her voice trembled as she turned the yellowed pages. "She wrote about us," Melinda said softly when she noticed me, "about how proud she was. Of both of us." I sat beside her and looked at the open page. Mom's handwriting danced across it, full of love and longing. "My girls are night and day, but together they make the world whole. One burns quietly, the other loudly, but both with love." Tears blurred my vision. Mom stirred, then her eyes fluttering open. "Are you two still fighting over who's the sun and who's the moon?" she whispered, smiling weakly. We laughed, both of us clutching her hands. "Not anymore," I said. "I'm glad," she murmured. "It took you long enough." She passed 2 weeks later in her sleep, her face peaceful, her hands resting over the blue blanket she'd been crocheting. The house felt unbearably quiet afterward. Even the air seemed to move slower, heavy, with all the words we wished we'd said more often. We buried her beside Dad under the old oak tree at St. Mary's Cemetery. It was a gray, windless day, the kind that seemed to pause time. As the pastor spoke, I felt Melinda slip her hand into mine and squeeze it tightly. "She loved you so much," she whispered. "She loved us both," I said. After the service, we stood together watching as the last shovel of earth covered her resting place. Then Melinda turned to me. "I want to help with the store full time. Not because I owe you, but because it's the first place I've felt useful in a long time." I nodded, smiling through the ache in my chest. "Then stay. There's always room." The following months passed quietly. Melinda proved herself more than I ever expected. She had a good eye for style and marketing, things I'd never cared much about. The store grew even more successful, and we decided to open a new branch dedicated to restoring items donated by families in need. We called it Second Chances. When the first customers came in, I watched Melinda talking to an elderly man who wanted to sell his late wife's wedding ring. She listened intently, tears in her eyes, then offered to keep it in the display window with a small card that read, "In memory of Grace, 1945-2020. Later, I asked her why she'd done it. "Because some things," she said, "aren't meant to be sold. They're meant to be remembered." That's when I realized how much she had changed, and how much I had too. A few months later, we hosted a small charity event at the main store. The mayor came, a few local journalists, even a reporter from a national magazine who'd heard about our work. When she asked for an interview, I almost declined. But then I thought of Dad's letter, of his words. "You were never meant to fit into their world. You were meant to build your own." So I stood before the cameras and told my story. The years of struggle, the humiliation, the judgment, the long nights of rebuilding broken furniture, as if repairing a part of myself each time. I told them about my family too. How we'd lost our way chasing what sparkled, and how love found its way back through humility. When the article was published a week later, the headline read, "The woman who turned discarded things into gold and found her family along the way." Melinda framed it and hung it behind the counter. "Dad would have loved this," she said. "I think he'd just be glad we're finally on the same side," I replied. We both laughed, and for the first time I realized I wasn't carrying the past anymore. It was carrying me forward. Years passed. The store grew into a brand that spanned across states, known not for wealth, but for heart. People came to second chances, not just to shop, but to heal, to donate, to rebuild, to remember. And every piece we restored carried with it the belief that broken things could be beautiful again. One spring afternoon, as I stood at the register, a woman approached me with her young daughter. She smiled shyly and said, "I don't want to buy anything. I just wanted to thank you. Your store gave me hope. When my husband left, I thought I had nothing. But seeing how you rebuild these things, it reminded me I could rebuild my life too." Her words lodged in my throat like a lump of light. "Thank you," I managed. "That means more than you know." After she left, I sat on the old stool behind the counter, watching the sunlight pour through the front window. Dust floated like gold in the air. It struck me then, everything I had ever needed was already here. Love, purpose, peace. Melinda joined me a few minutes later, brushing sawdust from her hands. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Dad," I said softly, "and how he was right. The world may laugh at you for being different, but in time, it'll come looking for your kind of light." She smiled. "So what now?" Now I looked around at the customers chatting, the shelves gleaming with treasures, Mom's photo smiling down from the wall. "Now we keep going." Melinda nodded, her eyes bright. Together. That night, as I closed the store, I caught my reflection in the glass door. My hair had more silver now, my hands bore the lines of labor, and my clothes were still simple, comfortable, lived in. The same cardigan now patched in places, draped around my shoulders. But I saw no shame in it anymore. I thought of that night years ago, sitting at Melinda's table, feeling small under the weight of their judgment. If I could go back, I'd tell that younger version of myself one thing: you are not defined by what you wear or by who underestimates you. You are defined by what you rise from. I turned off the lights and stepped into the cool night air. The sign above the door glowed softly. The Parker Collection, where everything deserves another chance. The world had taught me a cruel lesson once, that worth had a price tag. But life, in its strange mercy, taught me a better one. True value isn't in what we own, but in what we choose to restore. As I walked home beneath the streetlights, the wind brushed against my face like a quiet benediction. I knew then that I had found my freedom not in money, not in revenge, but in peace. And that peace after everything was my greatest fortune. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true worth isn't measured by appearance or wealth. It's found in resilience, compassion, and the courage to start over. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below, telling me your thoughts. Your story might inspire someone too.